Welcome to part one of a three-part series on rediscovering the Sefer Yetzirah. Part one is called, When Did a Mother Become Masculine? The Sefer Yetzirah is the oldest esoteric Hebrew text. It is attributed to Abraham, who, if historical, lived 1500 to 1800 before Common Era. So that's 3,500 to 3,800 years ago. This is way before the actual Torah or Old Testament was written. And it's very interesting because Abraham is the patriarch of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. They all share that same book, that same Old Testament, the Torah. So they all share the same Genesis story. You know, the one with the wicked Eve and that terrible snake and that horrible tree. Well, if we look at the Sefer Yetzirah, we will see that the creation story, the Genesis story that is attributed to Abraham, is very different. This little text was a oral tradition, and it was a hermetic tradition. Hermetic means to be sealed, airtight. It was secret. And because of this, because of the secrecy and the fact that it wasn't written down, we obviously cannot prove the date of its conception. It is mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, but that's already in the Common Era, in 500 CE, was when that was written. But in that book, they do refer to the Sefer Yetzirah. And it's only until the 10th century that all of a sudden we get three versions that pop up. Of course, you have to realize that this oral tradition has now been passed down for at least centuries, if not millennial. And so, like a game of telephone, it's getting probably changed as it passes from one generation to the next. And by the time it gets to the 10th century, the Rabbi Sadia Gaon literally says, I'm going to quote him here, "It is not a common book, and many people have been careless in changing or transposing the text." And a century later, Rabbi Yehuda Barceloni also says there are many versions, some very confused. This is just what happens when we pass on a tale, like in the game of telephone. But we did get these three different versions, the short version, the long version, and the Sadia version after, which was named after this Rabbi Sadia Gaon. So what is this little text? It's a mystical riddle, and it really is a mystical riddle. It's a wonderful thing because it's not dogmatic. It doesn't tell you how you're supposed to think or how it works. Instead, it gives you clues on how to build a tree. And once you build the tree speaks for itself in the way that it functions, in the way that its system is set up. So it's more like the hermetic secret is unlocked once you complete the mystery. To really understand the process of creation and this experience that we're living, according to the Sefer Yetzirah, you have to understand the symbol. So all of the implications and all of that will be dealt with in part two of this three-part series. What I'd like to do just briefly before we jump into Goddess Land is just explain what this system and all other Kabbalistic systems for that purpose are basically saying. So it's the idea that the omnipresent self-manifests into this world of experience. This is the body, this experience we have is sort of the dream body of the one. And it's the dream body, just like in a dream. If I dream at night, I think that I'm dreaming of a whole bunch of people, but when I wake up in the morning, all those people were me. So there is only one, but there is this illusion of you and me going through time and space. And this is done through these 10 numerical paths. These are the 10 spheres that we see right here, and they give the chronology of the system. So the first emanations in this particular tree are starting from the top, and they emanate all the way down to the bottom. And they are intersected by 22 paths. And normally in the Sefer Yetzirah, each path is represented by just one letter rather than a whole sentence. And that letter goes on to represent an aspect of time, an aspect of space, an aspect of the personal soul, and a characteristic of humanity. And but the reason that we have all these words here is that this is a Renaissance tree, and even though it uses the system of 10 spheres and 22 paths, it is not only based on that. It's based on the midrash of all the different schools that were existing at that time and that Cordovero brought together to make a coherent one symbol that sort of combined the strongest aspects of these different schools. And they in turn are basing so much of it on the Zohar, which is a very voluminous text that was put together in the 13th century by Moses de Lyon. So just keep in mind that these symbols are appearing on the scene for the first time in the Renaissance. So we're talking 1,000 years after it's been mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, and 3,000 years plus if it was really Abraham who conceived that text. So it took a long time for somebody to actually make a symbol with the 22 letters and 10 spheres. So according to Genesis 11:31 of the Torah of the Old Testament, Abraham was from the Sumerian city of Ur, the birthplace of civilization, the great city of Ur. And the great city of Ur was founded in the 3rd dynasty by Ur-Nammu. And we're going to learn about Nammu. She was the great goddess. And you can see geographically that Ur is in Sumer, and Sumer is just below Babylonia. And this whole area is in modern-day Iraq. So I put it over, I've sort of superposed it here so you can see what we're looking at today. So that's Iraq, and these countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, this is all part of the Levant, Palestine, and of course, Egypt. All these countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia included, were all goddess-based. They were all started, their oldest religions are goddess-based. And today, it couldn't be more opposite. So it's interesting to see what happened. How did that goddess fall? What happened? I don't try to answer that question. I think Merlin Stone in her book, When God Was a Woman, does a great job of talking about the Indo-Europeans that came onto the Persian Peninsula and brought the patriarch with them, and over thousands of years the myths got rewritten, and the goddess got usurped. But this is basically to give you a window into these goddesses at the time before and during Abraham's life. So so here we have all of that, and we're going to go to really understand what people were thinking at that time. We need writing. So writing didn't come around. Mythical writing only started in 2600 before Common Era. It existed before, but it was mostly log keeping, meaning that it was found in the temples of Inanna. So it was a priestess, it was women who started writing. And the women, because of their sexual freedom, had children that they didn't know who the fathers were. And so the only way to assure the lineage was to have the inheritance go from the mother to the daughter. And so you had the women that would keep track of the land and the inheritance and all those things. And when we do get mythical writing, we can, a lot had changed already from earlier times, but we can still get a glimpse into the world of the great goddess. We can get a very good glimpse. So the first most primeval goddess on the Sumerian gods and god lists, if we go to the early dynastic period, or the Pharaoh period, we get the first listing of Sumerian gods and goddesses. And it's consequently called the Pharaoh God List by Kaepernick in 1986. And it's here we find the goddess Nama for the first time. She's usually described as a fish or something aquatic, but here, honestly, she looks like a snake. That's how I see her in this picture. And the snake is a huge, huge part of all this goddess worship. So, and her role as primeval mother, we don't know about from the first goddess list. We know about it from a later goddess list from Littke in 1998, who discovered it, and he says that she, or what he translated, said that that Namu was the original goddess who created heaven, and the god of heaven, who is Anu. And if anybody studied a little bit of Mesopotamian religion, we know that Anu is usually at the head of the pantheon, when really he was not there originally. He's the son of the great Namu or Nama. And the great Namu or Nama was so much a mother figure that, for etymology's sake, the word for mother in Sumerian is Namu and Nama. It comes from this great goddess. So she also not only created the god of heaven, but she created the earth, and she created the goddess of earth to caretake for it, Ki, that was her daughter. And her children include the well-known Enki, which, again, if you've studied any kind of Mesopotamian history, religion, Enki was a big figure, a big inscription on a temple that was created by King Lugal-Kisal. He was a king of Uruk from the early dynastic III period. He dedicated a temple to Nama, where he claims Anu is her spouse, is her consort. So this idea, first of all, that the primeval goddess marries her son is a very classic story. Why is it so classic? Because if the goddess is all that there is, where does she get her spouse from? She has to birth him. And this story carries into the whole pagan tradition. It's a very, very interesting story, and you're going to see it all over the region. The mother who births her consort, and we see it in the Sefer Yetzirah. So the founder, as I mentioned, of Ur was Ur-Nammu, and he ruled 2012 BCE to 2095 BCE. The last we sort of hear about Namu, she was sort of a dying out goddess at the time that writing came into place, but we hear about her in the mid-second millennial in the Sumerian poem of Enki and Ninmah, where again she's called the primeval mother to all the gods and goddesses, and she is the one that creates with her son Enki humankind. So I have just a little worshiper here from Mesopotamia. She's just giving you, because I don't have that many pictures of Namu. And when we go into northern Mesopotamia, up towards Babylonia, we see Mama or Mami, which is basically Namu or Namu, Nama or Namu, excuse me, it's like a tongue twister. And the goddess Mami or Mama is the oldest Akkadian name for the mother goddess. She's the one we know in the most ancient one we know of. So she's very, very similar to Namu. Nama, and even though I don't have an actual picture of her, this isn't supposed to be her. These are more like priestesses and from the region. I have a beautiful Akkadian hymn, which I'll give you just one verse from. And it says, "Friends, hark, heroes, listen. This song about Mama is sweeter than honey and wine. She is the lady of the womb, and as such, she is the one who molds the creatures. She is the creator of gods and goddesses. She creatress of everything." She's got mega status, that Mama Mami. So if we move over to modern day Iran on the other side of Sumer, into the land of Elam, as it was called back then, you have Kiririsha, and she was originally on the top of the pantheon as the primeval mother who birthed the gods and the goddesses and humankind. And this particular sculpture is 4,000 years old, so 2000 BCE, and it's one of many that look like this that were found in Elam. And like the other goddesses that we've just started looking at, her consort was her son. And according to Walter Hinz, who's the director of Iranian studies at the University of Göttingen in Germany, she held her place at the top of the pantheon until the mid-second millennial, when her son and consort, Humban, took her place at the top of the pantheon. And so this dethroning of the goddess is going to become the norm across the entire region. Okay, so we're going to skip over the Levant for the moment and go straight to Kemet, to Egypt, where we find their version of the Mama Nama. We find her in the goddess Nate. And I'm so sorry that my image is not very high quality, because it's actually a very beautiful sculpture. And Nate is the not only the primeval goddess, but the goddess of the heavens. And these are representing stars, the whole galaxy that is around her neck, like a beautiful necklace. Yes, and we must not confuse her, because I tell you, I was confused at first with Nut, because Nut is also known as Nuit, which sounds like the French word night. And she was also, you've probably seen her in pictures with Geb, the earth god, where she's arched over him like the queen of the night. And the main difference between Nut and Nate is that Nut is the daughter of Shu and Tefnut, and Nate is daughter of no one, because of course Nate is the primeval goddess. And at the temple of Esna, we can read, inscribed in the walls, we can read, unique goddess, mysterious and great, who came to be in the beginning and caused everything to come to be. ... The divine mother of Ra. The Greek writer and philosopher Plutarch, who lived at the turn of the millennial, 50 to 120 Common Era, wrote that her temple at Sais, which is now destroyed, so we only have his word about this, held this inscription: I am all that has been, that is, and that will be. No mortal has yet been able to lift the veil that covers me. So now we can go forward in time to a very famous goddess who is Isis. And here we see Isis with her brother Osiris and with their son Horus. So for any of you not familiar with the story, Isis and Osiris are sister and brother, and Osiris dies, and Isis brings him back to life. And as she brings him back to life, just enough so that she can make their son Horus, who goes on to be the rising sun. And Osiris is I've heard often compared to the setting sun. And speaking of comparisons, Sir James Fraser, who wrote that incredible book, which should absolutely be in everybody's library, The Golden Bough, wrote Osiris was the mythical personification of nature. Isis brought life to the dead god and resurrected him. The story of one god that dies to be resurrected as his child is seen in reverse with the Greek story of Demeter and Persephone. Now, the big difference here being that the female Demeter is now personifying nature instead of the masculine Osiris. So in this story, very briefly, Demeter loses her daughter Persephone to the land of the dead. And long story short, she recuperates her, her daughter is saved, but with conditions that she can only come back for half the year. But when she does come back, she is now the mother. She is now the regenerated life and nature. So, and we see this also with the Wheel of the Year. So that's a story that could use a whole presentation in itself, and I'm not going to do that right now. But I think it's important, even though it's a later system, to really see how it mirrors the system. And that story is of the goddess who births the god on the winter solstice, which is the very longest night of the year. And little by little, he grows stronger, meaning the days get longer, until we hit the equinox. And on the equinox, the days are equal length to the nights. And by this time, we have the goddess and the god already making love, and the flowers are starting to bloom in the fields, and spring. At that time, there were 8 festivals, but at that time, the equinox was seen as the height of spring rather than the beginning of spring. So, and as we know, at the March 21st, there is already quite a bit of life all around us. So their adventures of lovemaking and flirtation get all the way to the longest day of the year, which is the summer solstice on June 21st. And on that day, I guess it's so explosive that he starts dying that little death. Day by day, the days start getting shorter, and we are told that the god goes into the grain, because even though the days are getting shorter, the grains are getting more and more abundant in the fields, all the way up to the autumn equinox, which is September 21st, and that's when the god is killed, because we take the final harvest. And he goes through the land of the dead, and he realizes that he is actually in the womb of his wife, the goddess. And so when he is reborn, in fact, he was his own father, and she is, of course, her own mother. And I love that particular story because it's so balanced, and each part is so necessary and beneficial to the other. Now, this sort of hieros gamos, this lovemaking between, the spiritual world and the material world, is seen all throughout the region. And one of if we return to the land of Abraham, to Sumer, the most famous couple is, of course, Inanna and Tamuzi. A little bit about Inanna and Tamuzi. So they have pretty much the same story. Tamuzi is representing nature, and he has to die, and she resurrects him. Inanna was said to have come from the planet Venus, and she was also seen as the queen of heaven. And she represented that great force that recycled life, made it eternal. Now, I want to show you the flip side of her loving character, which is the warlike Inanna. Now, you'll see this in the Sefer Yetzirah, and you see it all over the place, where you get in a goddess or a god a polarized nature. So if Inanna is the goddess of love, she must therefore be the goddess of war. And in the Sefer Yetzirah, you could take something as simple as grace. If a letter represents grace, it also represents ugliness. So you always have those two sides of the same thing. So now we're going to go a little bit up north to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, and here we have Ishtar. Ishtar is basically Inanna. She's just the northern version. And her lover, instead of being Damuz or Damuzi, is Tammuz or Tamuzi. And again, she is the spark of life. And when she makes love to her consort, all the fields start blooming in flowers and the pomegranates hang heavy on the trees and life is regenerated. And this is really what these poems speak to. They sing the most glorious song of the regeneration of life that is made through their lovemaking. And I have to say that in those times, they would actually, there would be a priestess who would embody Ishtar. And she would take a king for 1 year, and he would represent her consort. And that king would physically be killed at the end of the year. And so, because there was this belief that there was going to be eternal life in the bosom, in the womb, in the connection with Inanna, there was supposedly no fear of this mortal man who took the priestess who embodied Ishtar. But he had to physically die at the end of the year. And of course, that custom eventually died out because we don't have it today. And it might have been one of the things, that pushed the boys to get, like, hey, we don't want to die anymore. We don't want to play this role. Who knows? That's something we're going to discuss afterwards in the Q&A and in the conversation. So, yes, but there we go. That is Ishtar, the Babylonian version of Inanna. And I'm going to show you another image of her, which is not as nice as the last one, but you see her standing on the lion again. And here she's holding a staff of 2 snakes, which are wrapped around and face in opposite directions. You see this with the Minoan priestesses in Crete, except they have one in each hand, and you see it in the Caduceus, and you see, the whole idea of 2 intertwined snakes is a very, very archetypal thing. I grew up in Asia. I saw it all over Asia. You see it in Mesoamerica. It's an archetype. And by the time we have writing, we are to learn that snakes were the symbol of the goddess and often symbolize wisdom or prophecy. Nahas, the Hebrew word for snake in a verb form, means to practice divination or fortune telling. So the etymology of the word snake literally means prophecy in Hebrew. So this was a definite eye-opener when I learned that. And when we get to the ocean, we find the Semitic people who are Phoenicians at that time, and they called Ishtar Ashtart, or Astarte, or Ashtorete. This image is of Astarte, so you see again, she's standing on the lion, she's got the serpentine figures all around her. And Astarte, that particular name, was so important to the Egyptians that they incorporated her into their own mythology. And the great Nate, the primeval goddess, actually resolved the dispute between Set and Horus by offering Astarte to Set. So that's a very interesting thing. So now we come to another sort of Sumerian Egyptian mix. This little sculpture is in the Iraq Metropolitan Museum, and it doesn't have a title. It is dated 900 to 800 before Common Era, which makes it more recent than a lot of the things we've been looking at, but still very old, still in the before Common Era. And what is very enigmatic about it is that on one hand, if I look quickly at her, I think it's Astarte with this flower she's holding, but then when I look at her even more closely, I see that she's wearing the winged solar disk of Isis that is flanked with these 2 cobras. And if we look just back at the last slide, we'll see that Astarte has the exact same flower in her hand. You see? The flower is the same. And so does this mean that Astarte is synonymous with Isis? Is she the goddess that transcends these cultures and is actually one? So it raises all kinds of little questions, this piece, and it's very beautiful. So now we arrive at the great goddess, the Semitic goddess Asherah, who was revered and loved at the time of Abraham. And we first read about in around 1750 BCE in tablets, cuneiform tablets, so these predate the writing of the Torah. And she is called Ashratun or Asratu. And she's the bride of the Sumerian god Anu. And you might remember that Anu is the consort and son of Namu, the first primeval goddess that predates Asherah. So by now, since Asherah is the big wig in the area, he becomes her consort. But that doesn't last long, because by 1450, El is a much more important god in that region, and he takes her as his consort. Sandra Sham, the editor of Near Eastern Archaeology and a contributing editor to Archaeology, the magazine, says, Asherah is arguably the most important goddess in the Canaanite pantheon, the prototypical mother of gods and humans and consort of the chief god El. She is also the mistress of the sea and the land, and protector of all living things. According to the tablets found in Ugarit, which date to 1450 BCE, Asherah and her consort El are the parents to a pantheon of gods and goddesses, which are also deity gods and goddesses for the different nations. And in this list, we have the first mention of Yahweh, of Yod-He-Vav, otherwise known as Jehovah or Yahweh, and he's the God of the Hebrew nation. And we find that he's not the omnipresent God. He is the son of Asherah and El. And you're going to see, not in this section, not in this presentation, but if you watch the next presentation, you'll see that in the Sefer Yetzirah, he is also not source. Yahweh is also not the original creator, creatrix, and is the son of the three mothers and the three fathers that are in the center of the soul, the original source. And anyway, all the gods want to be Asherah's consort, and she keeps on becoming claimed by different ethnic groups in the area. Eventually, Baal, who you might have heard of in the Bible, he's usually being trashed, Baal managed to usurp the position of El. And we hear in the Torah that the worship of Asherah and her consort Baal makes Yahweh jealous. He's a very jealous God. He's like the demiurgus' God, where he thinks he's source. He's the ultimate ego deified. He thinks he's source, and he's jealous, and he punishes people for liking anyone else but him, because he's the best. Anyway, and by 850, 750 BCE, so we're talking about 500 years, 600 years later, 700 years later, Yahweh finally gets his way, and she becomes his consort. If you can't beat him, join him. So we see the inscriptions found at Kuntilet, Airud, and they say, I bless you through Yahweh of Samaria and through his Asherah. And at Al-Qom, from the same period, we have this inscription, Uriyahu the king has written this, blessed be Uriyahu through Yahweh, and his enemies have been conquered through Yahweh's Asherah. So, the Torah tells us Asherah was both revered by female royals, female queens, such as Queen Mother Makkah from Kings 15:13, as well as by the common Hebrew woman. To quote from Jeremiah 44:19, when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did not our husbands know that we were making cakes impressed with her image and pouring out drink offerings to her? We can see through the Torah that until the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the Hebrew nation worshipped Asherah openly and abundantly. And after that, the relentless effacement of the sacred feminine began. There was great punishment for those who worshipped anyone else but Yahweh. Asherah, Ashtoreth, and her tree of life, which is also called the Asherah, were no longer favored. The community was told to tear down her sculptures from the temples and burn her sacred Asherah poles. Punishment by death was decreed for those who continued to worship her. Biblical scholar William H. Deaver says, Asherah was buried long ago by the establishment. Now, archaeology has excavated her. So we can follow this great goddess from her place of reverence and love in the hearts of the people to the Genesis story. She's actually quite defiled along the way in that book, but it sort of culminates in the Genesis story, where sort of the whole aspect of a mother creatress is absolutely effaced. And all the things that were powerful to her, like her tree and her snakes, are at the center of this sort of disaster that Eve herself, the personified first woman, sort of brings on. And it's a very troubling and dangerous view of women. The whole Torah is filled with restrictions and rules to tame women and to get rid of the goddess. Some of these Old Testament rules are still upheld in certain countries. These are some of the rules that I just skimmed through, found, and noted. So, woman was created for man's pleasure. She should not follow her heart, but the religion of her husband. She must not speak until spoken to. Being a priestess or worshiping the goddess is not only forbidden, but punishable by death. A woman should hide herself so she does not tempt man. A wife, if raped, can be sentenced to death by her husband if he feels like it. And this I saw back in 1992, when I was in Pakistan. There was a woman at that time that was being stoned to death for being raped. She needed 7 witnesses to be able to exonerate her. So these are things that really have 2,000 years later are still holding ground. A woman, no matter how hard she builds her home, can be divorced without any compensation by a simple letter from her husband. Now, these things, we think about the New Testament as being the redemption and the male energy. And I do believe that the Christ energy, which is full of love and compassion and had Mary by his side, is a redemption. But it's not how the Bible was written. I think there's one thing between sort of the Gnostic Christians and the the New Testament of Constantine, which was, of course, put together in 324 at the Council of Nicaea. And that's a whole nother story, but extremely fascinating. Anyway, so we see this trend continue into the Christian text. And in Timothy 2:11, we can read, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. So basically, we're just we're just screwed. There's nothing we can do about it. It's been imprinted in Genesis, in the beginning of our story, that we are just bad news, us girls. So it's very interesting to see how we came to this point, and this will be the second part of this presentation, will be a discussion on this and how do we bring back this balance. Okay, so now we can come full circle back to the Sefer Yetzirah, but I think it will become evident why it was so necessary to see these archetypes in the region where this text was written, and to sort of understand it, and also to understand how humanity rewrites stories. We rewrite our paradigm, and how, as we try to figure out the great mystery, we change the stories according to our socio and political and religious or whatever philosophical needs at that moment. And I can suggest two great authors who speak of the historical devolution of the goddess. And the first one I've mentioned before, Merlin Stone, who wrote When God Was a Woman, and that is an excellent book. And she shows how all the stories and the myths were rewritten as the Indo-Europeans came through and installed their patriarchy throughout the region. And she attributes it, she believes that because they could not establish paternity with the freedom of the sexual freedom that the women had, because they couldn't establish paternity, they had to make the rules really, really strict. And who knows, that might have been one of the catalysts. It's very interesting to try to figure out why our brothers had to do this to us. So, and maybe do we need to figure it out? Maybe we just need to talk about how to bring up the balance again. So back to this Sefer Yetzirah creation process, or iration, or self-manifestation, whatever you want to call it. And this process starts with three mothers. And these mothers birth the first three fathers. You can read about it in chapter 3 of the long version, or in any of the other versions, but I know it's chapter 3 in the long version. And these three fathers are breath, water, and fire. And you'll see that also from them, you'll see in a second, you get also earth and you get air. So that the very beginning of this creative process is starting with the basic elements. So because the actual process, according to the Sefer Yetzirah, is quite complicated, I'm going to let you watch this little animation I made, which makes it a little bit clearer, because if you're already familiar with the text, you will know that not all the information is in one place. You have to know the text well enough to see some of the clues at the end of the book, some of the clues at the beginning of the book. So, I hope this is helpful. I say we start in the beginning sphere. In chapter 1, verse 9, we read that the beginning sphere is also called the breath of the living one. Therefore, we can safely say that the breath of the living one appears in the beginning. We also know that breath is a father born of Mother Aleph. If we consider that a breath needs a breather to be born, then it means that within the first and beginning sphere, Mama Aleph breathed the first breath of life. Aleph is queen over breath, and together they create the chest in the soul, the temperate in the year, the element air, the angels of breaths, and the second dimension, which is created through the 4 direction breaths of heaven. In chapter 1, verse 12, we read that the third sphere of good is also called water from breath. We know that the mother Mem births water, and now we know breath is the father of water. Mother Mem creates with her son, and he is actually her true consort. Mem is queen over water, and together they create earth, the third dimension, and chaos. As we have seen, they also manifest as aspects of time, space, and the soul. Sphere 4 is called fire from water. We know that Mother Shin births fire, and now we know water is the father of fire. Mother Shin creates with her son, and he is her true consort. Shin is queen over fire, and together they create the heavens and ministers of flaming fire. As we have seen, they also manifest as aspects of time, space, and the soul. So what we can see from this little presentation is that the fathers are the manifest world. They are the manifest foundation of the universe, time, and soul. And this is explained in chapter 6 of the long version, that the mother letters make up the names of God, and the fathers make up the foundation of the material world. And of course, this archetype we have seen. We just saw it with, of course, Inanna and Ishtar and their consorts, Tammuz and Dumuzi. We also saw it with Osiris in Egypt, and later on with Geb, who is also an earth god. And we saw it with, we didn't see it in this presentation, but it is seen with the pagan Pan, the Celtic's green man, and the sun/nature's role in the wheel of the year. So one other thing that's very interesting that I've seen from this process is that Aleph is the original Virgin Mother. The Virgin Mother being like Namu or Mama or Nate. You know, she is the one that, she is the first vehicle that the Ein Sof, that the ineffable omnipresent one manifests through. She's not impregnated by anyone else. Afterwards, she creates her consort, Breath, who goes on and impregnates Mem, and she births her consort, Water, who impregnates Shin, but Aleph is not impregnated by anyone. So this makes her the original Virgin Mother, the great primeval goddess. Okay, so let's take a quick peek at these modern Kabbalistic trees. When I say modern, they're Renaissance trees and a little later, but they're old trees that are at the root of our magical systems that we use today. And you will see that there was a flip, what I call the flip. Now, the flip is very interesting because we see it even in the Sefer Yetzirah. We see that when the mothers, the great mothers, are being referred to, they're referred to as he and kings. And if you ask a Kabbalist if Aleph is masculine or feminine, they'll tell you she is masculine because we have this flip. Obviously, I mean, we can all make up our own minds on this, but if you talk about a mother who births the first father, it just doesn't sound very masculine. I mean, afterwards you can be an apologist for it, whatever, but that's the way I see it. She's as feminine as it comes. So, and we see this flip also in these systems. So I'm going to quickly look at them before we conclude. And in these systems, you have in the top sphere, you have spirit, and it is called Keter in these systems. And at the bottom, you have spirit manifest, which is Malkut. So as we know, what we've seen with the Sefer Yetzirah, it is the mothers who create this, the manifest world. It is Aleph who breathes the first breath, the breath being the father. And that the fathers are the elemental world, and they go on to be the hands and the nose and the toes of the body. They are the components and aspects of the universe, time, and space. So they are the material world. And so normally they would be down here as Malkuth, And Aleph, the Great Mother, would be up here as Keter, but it's not the case. This is considered masculine in these cases, in these trees, and this is considered female. Now here's the other big female-male polarity. You have up here, you have Bina, the great supernal goddess, and you have Chochmah, the great supernal god. Now Chochmah is the feminine noun for wisdom, just like Sophia. She's wisdom. And we can read all the way in Proverbs 3:18 that Chochmah is a her and a she. Because if we look at Proverbs 3:18, it says, all her ways are pleasant, and all her paths are peaceful. She is a tree of life to those who embrace her, and those who lay hold of her are blessed. So we have that flip once more. That brings us to the end of this little presentation. Ultimately, I see us as one. This is an alchemical symbol, and you'll see that the Kabbalah is deeply rooted in alchemical magic. And the idea is that to be in perfection, we need to make the body spirit and the spirit body, and we need to be androgynous because the one has two parts that are female and male. It is beyond gender and it includes all gender. So, we have to embrace that in its best potential, which is in balance. And that leads us to the question and answer and the conversation. So thank you for listening.